Hi everyone, and welcome to this last video on thesis writing and motivation. In this video we're going to look at don't know how to do it. So in the previous videos we've looked at the main reasons for a lack of motivation and why we procrastinate. Don't want to do it was about having no motivation and what to do about that. Too much going on to do it was about the distractions that we often face, and afraid to do it is about working in this critical environment. So in this video what we're going to look at is don't know how to do it, and this is about the formats and structures of academic writing or thesis writing. So when I say don't know how to do it, I really am not talking about your ability to do your thesis or your intellect. I'm talking about the nature of writing a thesis and publishing. I'm talking about the types of documents we have to produce and how complex they are and what you need to know so that you don't get stuck on that complexity. So one of the things that I find is quite common is that students moving from undergraduate to graduate or from master's to PhD, or even once you've finished your doctorate and you move into an academic position, that often those transitions are where people get stuck and they find they're blocked. And that's often because the writing requirements change. They might be quite subtle, but it does change. So you might be saying to yourself, I've written assignments before, I know my research area, so why am I stuck now that I'm writing a thesis? And the reason is that the writing requirement changes as you move into different spaces. So if you move from a master's to a doctorate, you might find the long-term nature of the project is really quite different, and the strategies you use to get the master's done don't apply to this doctoral project. The work that we're doing is really cognitively complex. We're engaging in higher order thinking skills. We're pulling together all these things, from disparate components. We're pulling them together into a coherent linear form. And that really is quite difficult. And as you shift and you move from a master's to a doctorate, or even a thesis to a paper, you'll find that those things shift as well. The way we have to do them shift. So within this environment, there are multiple formats of writing, and audiences and disciplinary requirements. So even, if you take a journal article that you've framed for one journal and then change it and then want to shift it to another journal, you will have to change it because it won't quite meet the requirements of the new journal. So really what I'm trying to say is that it may seem like all the writing is the same, but there are very subtle and significant changes in the different formats and different products that we produce. And sometimes we think, well, this is just my fault, and because I can't write. But really, it's a lack of understanding of what is needed to produce that particular document. So, in terms of the language skills, in terms of, what needs to go into it, what the audience wants from that document. And in addition to all of this is all the other things that go with it, the organizational skills we need to have in order to produce this research, the reading, the note taking, the collecting together and making it into this coherent thing. And these are only a few of the things that we're doing on a daily basis. So the reason why it's so complex is that we really are involved in knowledge transformation, moving from knowledge telling into producing something new. And we have to do it in this coherent, linear way from quite a chaotic world out there with multiple sources and so much information out there. We have to select, synthesize, evaluate, and then pull it together into a coherent, new, whole that is original. So it is very complex and it's important, and it can be the reason why you get stuck. That's what I'm trying to get at. So procrastination happens because we sit down to write in our scheduled writing time and we just don't know how to begin. So we'll say to ourselves, okay, in today's session, I'm going to write the literature review. And then you sit down and you feel totally overwhelmed, because what you're doing in a literature review is you're taking all this reading that you've done. You have to select pieces from that. You're describing, you're summarizing the readings, you're describing, but then you're also analyzing, you're synthesizing those readings, you're selecting and synthesizing, you're critiquing them, so you're evaluating them. You have to group them into themes or arguments that support your argument or counter arguments, um, and then construct an argument around that in a coherent whole. So it's a very complex document. And unless you know what needs to go into that genre, into that structure, it can be quite difficult to begin. So, so procrastination happens when you sit down to do this, and it becomes overwhelming because you don't have a way forward. So you feel like you need to get up and go and do something else. And the other point I wanted to put in there is that often, people feel that if they ask for help, it's a sign of failure. So if you say to somebody, I don't know how to write the literature review, um, it may seem as if that's somehow an indication that you are not up to par. But actually, that's the question you should be asking: is how should I write this literature review? And yeah, so motivation drops when we can't see a way forward. So then our emotions become negative, and our critical voice then kicks in and says, this is terrible, go and find something else to do. I'm sure you know this diagram by now, where the task is overwhelming, so we feel anxious and out of control, and then we go and do something that makes us feel in control. So the very first thing we need to do is to become aware of avoidance tactics and then to analyze why we are avoiding. So is it because of our emotions? Is it because we're being distracted? You know, or is it because we actually don't know what goes into this chapter? And if it's because we don't know what goes into this chapter, there are definitely things we can do. So the very first thing for me is always to begin with your problem purpose statement, because that provides you with the direction and the focus. That, for example, will give you the concepts you need to unpack in the literature review. So the problem purpose statement is your number one go-to technique and strategy. But then the next thing would be to examine the anatomy or unpack the format of the writing that you're doing. So if you're working on the literature review, what would go into a literature review? What concepts do you need to unpack? What arguments what argument will you make? Is there a counter argument? Can you group the literature into debates? How would you situate yourself within that debate? So unpack what would go into that particular section or chapter. And then look at your reader's expectations, because there's always an unwritten contract between the reader and the writer. So in an introduction, a reader's expecting to be told what this project is about and to be oriented towards the project. A reader also wants to know why they should read on, which is your opportunity to explain the problem and why it's important to this paper or this project. So those kind of unwritten expectations are what you want to examine when you're unpacking the formats of a section or a chapter. A really good strategy is to read other similar dissertations or papers and dissect them. So if you're in education, go and read education dissertations and have a look at how the authors introduce the literature review, how they've explained concepts, So you're not looking at the content as much as you are looking at how it was written. Um, and explore, the various genres around thesis writing and publishing. An introduction chapter or an introduction section has its own format. The conclusion section has its own format. Um, Now, there might be variety and it might change, but at least you can make those decisions if you know what the most common formats are. Ask other students, students who are further along than you are. Ask your supervisor or other people in your departments. You know, you can say to them, what goes into a methodology chapter? What is the best way to write this chapter? And then brainstorm what should go into your section or chapter. And you can brainstorm the format and then brainstorm the contents in that format. So you might say, well, within the literature review, I'm going to have an introduction, then I'm going to explain my concepts, then I'll have a thematic review of the literature, then I'm going to explain where I fit in terms of the debates, and then I'll show the knowledge gap in terms of where my research fits in. So that's my brainstorming the formats. And then when you do the content over that, you'll be saying which concepts you'll unpack, which papers go into one theme or one part of the debate. So it'll be much easier to write if you've got a mind map that has all that thinking already down there. Then you can kind of group it, plan it, and develop an outline for the chapter. So the more you understand about what it is that you have to produce, the easier it will be to begin writing. And this will help increase your motivation, and then you can avoid procrastination. Now, the majority of my videos on YouTube are about unpacking academic genres. So search my name and have a look. There's a video on each chapter of the thesis and on the various sections of writing a paper for publication. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and the series, and I hope you've managed to get some strategies from this and have a much better understanding of procrastination and why we experience declining motivation. And best of luck for your research and your writing.